Eastern Washington. So you can get an initial skewing
You're right.
on that vote. And then all of a sudden, the major metropolitans weigh in, and all of a sudden, everything flips upside down a little bit. So I think we need to be very careful
Yeah.
tonight about putting our arms around too many numbers, at least this evening, until there's a second run of ballots.
So, as far as our state is concerned, 2 Senate seats, all 10 congressional seats are on the ballot tonight. No major surprises as far as the race for U.S. Senate. Incumbent Patty Murray ahead of challenger Tiffany Smiley. Now,
Yes.
as far as the points, though, of what you're seeing, walk us through the early analysis of this particular race.
Sure. The early numbers show Senator Murray with about an 11-point lead.
Mm-hmm.
And I would expect as more King County, Snohomish, Pierce County votes come in, that percentage will probably increase. How far it'll go, TBD, but it could get up to potentially 18 to a 20-point spread. Now, Tiffany, because a lot of those early counties in Eastern Washington came in, had a pretty good, really early number showing, right?
Right.
But I think the margin the difference will increase in that Senate race. And I don't expect that's going to show as a very competitive race, at least in the primary. What is, I think, more intriguing and fascinating, and we talked about this earlier on the newscast, Mary, is we have 2 members of Congress who, both Jamie Herrera Butler in the 3rd Congressional District, which is Southwest Washington, and Dan Newhouse, which is more Eastern Washington, Benton, Franklin, Yakima, Klickitat, is in the 4th Congressional District. Both of those Republican members of Congress were 2 of the 10 votes that voted for impeachment of Donald Trump after the January 6th insurrection. So they're being challenged by Trump-backed candidates in the primary. So those 2 races in particular, in my opinion, are extraordinarily fascinating to see what the Trump pull or isn't in Washington state in those 2 congressional districts. So that's a race that I'm going to pay those races particular attention tonight and tomorrow as these numbers roll in, Mary.
It's very difficult to unseat incumbents traditionally, as historic patterns have shown. How likely or unlikely is it that the 2 that you've mentioned actually risk losing their seats?
Well, I think early on the sense was that there was an opportunity for both of them to be at risk. I think some things have settled down in both of their races, and I think they're in much better shape. I think probably both of them are going to finish first tonight. Mm-hmm. Now, the question is, who finishes second? Is it going to be one of the Trump-backed candidates, Republicans, or is it one of those Democrats, which is not a strong, they're not going to be strong candidates in either one of those districts, going to sneak in with the second number of votes because there's a base D vote, at least with a number of candidates on the ballot to get them into the number 2 slot. So it's been these races, Mary. You've got Democrats spending money on Republicans, right, and Republicans spending money on Democrats to influence who's going to match up against the incumbents. It's a little bit wackadoodle with the kind of money that's being thrown around to trying to influence the other party's outcome. So it's politics has gone crazy.
I was going to say inflation or no inflation. I mean, with all the problems that we've seen around the world, if you were just to turn on the TV, the sheer number of political advertising that we're seeing, you could hardly tell there's a difference at all. There's all kinds of money being spent right now.
Yeah, and sometimes you don't even know who's spending it. There's so much more money being spent on independent expenditures than there are by the candidates themselves today. That has really taken over politics, not only here in Washington state, but across the country. I think the amount of money that's been spent in this primary and all the races, just in the primary, is probably between $35 and $40 million. Yes,
Wow.
it's a high, and then it's being spent on a primary in August when the voters are not particularly focused on elections, Mary. It's one of the things that just drives me a little bit crazy because these elections in Washington State, in my opinion, for the primary, don't get me going. Primaries important, particularly because of the way we have the top two vote getters,
Right.
two Republicans, two Democrats. I mean, you can go anywhere you want on your ballot. So the primary takes on even a bigger significance. You don't have the party discipline, if you will, right? And so I believe we either need to move our primary elections back to early in September, or do what Oregon does at the end of May or early June when voters are still focused. You know, Washingtonians as well as I do, the early August, which is the only time we have a little bit of summer around here. Sometimes it's more summer than we want, but they're really indifferent or diffident, if you will, to an election cycle in August. So a fewer voters are making these outcomes that are determinate for the ballot in November.
Well, the GOP wants to win back the Senate and the House, and for that reason, I mean, Washington State, it's getting a lot of attention right now. And you talked about the primaries, the importance of the primaries. It seems like everyone outside of the state understands it, except for Washingtonians.
Exactly. Yes.
There's a lot of pressure on the primary. Also, this year, and this is new, Ron, that 17-year-olds can vote as long as they turn 18 by November, before the general election. Was there any thought that could have an impact as far as the turnout at all? None whatsoever?
No, none. Because first off, even historically, 17, 18-year-olds, the only time they seem to be motivated to vote is in a presidential election, okay? And even at that time, their voter participation as a percentage of the population is even significantly less. What you have in our elections in the primary is you have a very strong skewing towards 55 plus as the voters that participate in our primary. And so, no, I don't think that would have negligible, if any, probably no impact on the outcome of any of these races we're going to be talking about, Mary.
All right, really quick, Ron, for people that are just tuning in online, I'm going to really quickly run through some of the latest numbers that I have. And bear in mind that depending on which news outlet that you may be looking at home or on your smartphone or what have you, and we've talked about this, Ron, it's really all over the place depending on who you're reading. I don't know why. It's a very frustrating situation, but it's the system that we have now.
Yeah, and it is, and it's not, it doesn't work particularly well in some respects. The integrity of the process is in place, but the randomness of when these votes get counted is what drives us all a little bit crazy, trying to figure out what it's going to look like in 2 or 3 days, because all of that can flip on you in the next 24 hours.
Absolutely.
So dangerous.
So really quickly, right now in the Senate, Patty Murray, 54%, Tiffany Smiley, 32%, District 1, Susan Del Bene ahead at 64%, Vincent Cavallari, 19%, the 2nd District, Rick Larson, the incumbent, 48%, Dan Matthews, 19%, the 3rd District, Jamie Herrera Butler. Now, this is the first initial dump of numbers that we're talking about. So right now, it looks like the incumbent, Herrera Butler, 24%, Marie Perez at 32%, and Joe Kent at 20%. Again, very early. District 4, right now, incumbent Dan Newhouse ahead at 27%, Doug White very close behind, 26%, Lauren Culp, 22%. That appears to be a tight race at the moment right now. Those are the first 4 districts, and of course the U.S. Senate race. Go ahead.
What's interesting, Mary, is that in the 2 races we were focusing on earlier, Jamie Herrera Butler in the 3rd and Dan Newhouse in the 4th, according to those numbers right now, both of the Trump endorsed candidates are not in the top 2. Lauren Culp was the endorsed candidate. The Democrat right now is edging out for the number 2 spot, and I forget, Joe Kent in the 3rd. Is that his name?
Yes.
Well, he is trailing in that race as well to get into the top 2. Both of those candidates are the Trump embraced challengers to our incumbents. So in that respect, if that holds up, and who knows, if that holds up, I think that the incumbents tomorrow or in 24 hours from now are going to go, whoosh, okay, that's over. Now Now let's get about being a member of Congress.
Well, on that note, we just got a statement from Senator Patty Murray. She went ahead and released a statement, and in part it says, quote, "I'm grateful to everyone who supported my campaign so far and more determined than ever to be a strong voice for Washington's values and priorities in the other Washington, because let's be clear, this is not a normal midterm election." Just a portion
Yes.
of what she has said tonight. Obviously
And then
sounding
her
very
number,
confident.
but for incumbents like U.S. Senator,
Yeah.
if you in the primary, if you're below 50%, if you're at 46, 47, 48, that's usually a little bit of a danger sign in the primary. And then, I mean, what, there's 16 or 17 candidates that are on the ballot, I think, for the U.S. Senate, Mary.
Yes.
And she's polling right now 54, 55%. That is a really, really strong showing. And so remember, I said that there was an opportunity for her to pull up 20 plus points ahead of Smiley. And I think what's the difference right now? 54 to 30.
54 to 32 at the moment.
Okay, that's 22 points. That's, I mean, it doesn't look to me at this point that Smiley would be a very serious challenger to Senator Murray.
The stakes are high for the primary as far as the overall political landscape for the country. What's it take to change the primary in our state? I know this is something that you're very passionate about. In the name of encouraging more people to participate, do their civic duty, to make it as palatable as possible for people to vote, make it easy for them. What's it take to change that process?
The legislature, the state legislature. Now, early on in my career, I started my career 2 years out of college as an elected official as a county auditor. And I always took the proposition that what can we do to remove the barriers between the ballot box and the citizen? And one of the things is the timing of elections, in my opinion, is so critical to that. Mm-hmm. And so back in the day, way back in the day when I was a young man and a county auditor, we had a September primary, which is when parents and kids are back to school. Yeah. People are getting focused again, and then unfortunately, some of my former colleagues in the county auditors cried aloud because they couldn't get the ballots ready for the general election. And I don't think election day should be held at the convenience of county auditors, but more what's in the interest of getting electoral participation. So there's, as I've suggested, I believe there's two paths here to take, Mary. Do what they do in Oregon. As a Clark County auditor, I said, in fact, I used to get a lot of calls saying, "Hey, how come we're not voting in the end of May, like across the river?" So that's a good time for a primary election. And then you get a break from elections for a while, for the summer. Then you can amp it back up after Labor Day. So that's one option. And the second one is early in September. But the legislature would have to do that. The legislatures would change it from September to August. And I think at the behest of a lot of these county auditors and elections officials. But I just think that's we got to find a way to change that and make it more responsive. So when the public is focusing on elections, the higher participation, we all benefit. Democrats, Republicans, independents, libertarians. Mm-hmm. If we get a broader participation, we have a better sense what the public really wants. And so there's my jihad for the evening, Mary.
You've got strong opinions about this, and it's because you want to see a higher turnout. And I have to tell you, I mean, with kind of along the lines of what you were saying, every time we cover primaries and before the ballots are counted, we get the same sound bites from the elections office. They kind of anticipated the low turnout, in this case, extremely low turnout. And the one thing that we don't often hear is, well, what do we want to do about it? How do we want to make it so that more people do vote?
The most important single thing we can do. There's other things we can do, but in my opinion, the one single most important thing we do is get rid of the August primary and you look at one of those two dates. And I think you'll see the participation will go up significantly with a change in those dates. And then the citizens of Washington State benefit from that.
All right. So this is the first dump of numbers, as we have been talking about, has been done. It's come through. The next dump happens tomorrow at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Ron. Right now, before we go, I'm going to ask you to read the tea leaves and kind of
Thank you.
anticipate
Oh,
how
yes.
what do you anticipate will happen tomorrow at 4 o'clock when the new numbers come down? What will flip? What may not flip?
Okay. So, can I invoke Winston Churchill with my first answer?
Go ahead.
Or Churchill, somebody else said, it's the ability to foretell what will happen tomorrow, next month, next year, and to be able to explain afterwards why it didn't happen. So I'm going to wrap my predictions around Mr. Churchill, and so there could be significant changes. That's number one, and just off the top, and particularly if there's some tight races. We don't the eighth district, for example, with the incumbent Congresswoman Schreier and that very competitive Republican base that's splitting in three different directions right now. Larkin and Dunn and what's the third gentleman's name? He was actually the Republican nominee 2 years ago. But anyway, so that could flip. I think the one thing that really looks pretty steady to me is the U.S. Senate race. I don't know. I mean, that's a 22-point margin, and as there's more King County votes come in, that's just going to solidify.
Yeah.
So anywhere in that range, Senator Murray is going to feel really good about those numbers. But I think we're going to have to wait and see what happens to those two Trump-backed candidates in the Southwest Washington and Eastern Washington to see if new votes come in, enough new votes that flip and move them into the top two. The vote doesn't show that, but that could change tomorrow at 4 o'clock, right? And all of a sudden, we don't have Trump in the money, so to speak, in those two congressional districts, and then his candidates could creep into the the win, place, and show, but at least in the place spot number two. So that was something I would watch very carefully. That and the eighth district are the ones that I think are very fluid at this point.
Right
but it
now,
looks
yes.
to me that Congresswoman Jamie Herrera Butler and Congressman Dan Newhouse look to be in very good shape, that they've locked up or pretty much locked up the number one spot. Okay. And so we go from there. So they'll probably be feeling pretty good tonight too.
And you were saying, as far as the tally and counting of the votes, it goes east to west, right? And talking about geography, votes from the eastern side of the state are counted first. Yeah.
The Secretary of State's office gets the reports from the counties, the Eastern Washington counties we have 39 counties in the state. The smallest ones are primarily in Eastern Washington. And so they can tally their voters very quick, and then they send them in to the Secretary of State's office. And you don't know that, okay, because they just put out the numbers and the percentages. But usually that's been historically what occurs, and I'm sure it has again tonight. And so that skews some of the numbers pretty dramatically until you hear from the 800-pound political gorillas in the Puget Sound of, King, Pierce, Snohomish, and Kitsap. They're 64% of all the votes in the state of Washington. When they come in, then you can figure out what the heck's going on.
Yeah, which could be 4 o'clock tomorrow afternoon.
We'll have a much better, particularly I think, the 8th district, Mary, in the Shire race and who the Republican is going to be in that race will be, we'll see. They could get close.
They're close. Jesse Jensen, Reagan Dunn, and Matt Larkin.
Yep. All three of them could be probably right in there. I always assumed that Reagan Dunn, because of his name ID, long time, mother was a member of Congress for a long time, Jennifer Dunn. He's been on the King County Council for a long time. That he would be the sort of the early odds favorite to be the number two spot. But Jensen has been running a very independent expenditure against Mr. Dunn that has the potential of suppressing his vote a little bit. But we'll know better at 4 o'clock tomorrow, Mary.
As always, appreciate your insight, Ron. And of course, tomorrow we can reanalyze what you said tonight.
Oh boy, you're going to hold me accountable, huh? I'm going to vote Mr. Churchill.
Ron, thanks so much. We'll
My
see you
pleasure.
tomorrow.
Enjoyed it.
Good
I've
night,
enjoyed
everyone. All right, I think we're off. Are we off?
I think we got through it okay without overcommitting.
Are we good?
it off.